This is the portion talking about the integrated research project related to the code validation for advanced codes. I'll give an introductory brief. My name is Richard Reister. I'm the program manager for the Light Water Reactor Sustainability Program. And first I'll give some background on the program and how this IRP fits in with the program. The goals of the Light Water Reactor Sustainability Program are to support the long-term, safe, and efficient operation of our existing existing nuclear power plants. We do that by dividing the program into 4 areas. The first area, it's about half the program, is the materials aging and degradation pathway, we call them, pathways. The second is advanced instrumentation information control technologies. The third is a risk-informed safety margin characterization, and I'll talk about that one a little bit more later because that's the area that this IRP involves. And then finally, the reactor safety technologies, and I'll talk about each one of those a little bit more. The materials aging and degradation looks at materials degradation, metals is typically what's looked at, and there's a list of various phenomena here that are investigated. But we're also looking at concrete, cables, and mitigation and repair and replacement technologies as well. The second area is the instrumentation and controls, and here we're addressing the long-term aging and reliability of the typically analog technologies that exist in our current plants. And so we're looking toward moving, facilitating the move by industry toward digital technologies. Third area is that I mentioned is the risk-informed safety margin characterization pathway. And here we're looking at advanced methodologies and techniques for conducting margins analysis. It's really mostly safety margins analysis. And we're looking at this methodology uses simulation-based studies of the margin analysis. And to do that process, we use advanced codes. Most of these codes are based on the MOOS framework. I think it's probably been mentioned here a few times this morning, the multi-physics object-oriented simulation environment, if I got that right. The biggest code related to that is RELAP 7 code. This is our next generation of thermal hydraulic systems codes, and it's a advanced computational tool and technique to allow faster and more accurate analysis of the thermal hydraulics environment. Again, it's a systems code for nuclear power plant thermal hydraulics simulation. Another code is the Raven code, and this is the simulation controller, and so this is what really drives the scenario that's of interest to that's being studied. So, and it handles the probabilistic analysis as well. And then finally, there's a Grizzly code, which is looking at materials aging degradation. And it's been focused mostly on the reactor pressure vessel now, but also we're looking at concrete degradation as well in terms of this Grizzly code. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the IRP. And finally, the reactor safety technologies area, and this is really looking at the lessons learned from the Fukushima accident. And the focus areas there are some long-term core cooling concerns for station blackout, looking at the sphere accident management guidelines, and collaborating with the Japanese on the forensic activities related to the accident as the plants are decommissioned and dismantled. So we'll get to these this afternoon. So the integrated research project is related to validation of advanced computer models. So the complexity of advanced simulation codes presents a challenge for traditional code verification and validation methods. Multiple simulation codes can be coupled together and address different scales ranging from whole facilities down to the atomistic scale physics. But to use these codes, especially in industry, and if you go use them in any type of licensing environment, extensive verification and validation is required for their use. So this integrated research project seeks the development of novel methodologies, and I'll stress that again. It's really novel methodologies for V&V suitable for advanced computer models, and the application of this methodology to the codes in the RISMAC toolkit. So it's really kind of a big picture looking at how a better verification and validation methods can be used to validate these codes. Some of the codes that we're looking at in the RISMAC toolkit, I mentioned some of these before. These first two, the neutrino code related to plant flooding model and the mastodon code related to seismic modeling, these codes actually are not MOVE-space codes, they're particle codes. So I'll point that out. These happen not to be MOVE-space codes. But the other three, Grizzly, Relapse 7, and Raven, are MOVE-space codes. Grizzly, again, is a component aging model. Relapse 7, the thermohydraulics, and Raven is a simulation controller and a probabilistic tool code. So what we're interested in is coming up with methodologies to use to validate these codes. I'll stress validation more than the verification. There's fairly sophisticated verification methods that are integrated into the code development tools that are in place now. So really the question is validation. So how can we develop methods that validate these complex codes? And when I say complex, I mean complex in the terms of both the codes themselves, but also in the fact that you can integrate these codes together. You couple the codes together and run various scenarios that will involve multiple codes. So how can you be certain that these multi-code simulations are giving you the answers that are valid for the real world scenarios? So I think that's about it.
Is adding Grizzly advanced concrete modeling capabilities considered in the IRP RC1 area, if it is included with complete V&V?
Well, certainly we would want to include the Grizzly code would be part of that, absolutely. But again, the focus of the IRP is on advanced V&V methods. So, Grizzly would be one of those codes, but we'd want a method that would apply to more than just the Grizzly code.
Is there interest in development of adjoint methods for uncertainty quantification and coupled criticality and burn-up calculations with high-fidelity codes?
I would say yes, but maybe Curtis could add some more.
Yeah, I think core physics is more aimed at the previous presentation. We're not doing so much with the core physics calculations within RISMAC toolkit. If there were methods that were being developed as part of that, that would be applicable to these other codes, I think the methods themselves may be of interest.
What is the difference between this IRP and the RC4 through RC7 scopes?
Well, I'll flip to the. So I will point out one of the work scopes, RC7. And RC7, which we'll talk about in a little while, but RC7 is focused on the validation of Relapse 7 specifically. And in this work scope, we're looking at more traditional methods of code validation. So when I talk about traditional methods, taking experimental data and using that and then running the code using that same input as the experiment would have used, and then validating the code that you get reasonable results from your code as you did with the experiment that matched the experimental data. So it'll be collecting that data, validating the code for different scenarios, and as most code validation is done today. the IRP is looking at different methodologies for code validation. And this is the traditional code validation activity. Curtis, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think it's the IRP is intended to be, of course, broader because it encompasses more tools and maybe you can think of it more scenarios, and this idea of scale, I think, does become more of an issue. And then I would reemphasize also it's intended to be more novel, non-traditional methods of validation, and to encourage research and thinking along that line.
What empirical data sets will be used for validation?
It depends on which tools are being proposed. So for example, Grizzly is looking at aging mechanisms. You would have to have then aging-related kinds of information. And so it really depends on the specifics of the proposal and the tools that are encompassed within that proposal.
Are new test facilities required to validate these codes?
Yeah, I think we're encouraging use of existing data as much as possible. We do in the call mention that if new experiments are needed and can be funded within the time and scope, then that could be part of the proposal.
Yeah, I wouldn't rule out that you couldn't have some small-scale facility built and used as part of the proposal if that made sense. But the proposal is not envisioning certainly a large-scale experimental program.
Are advanced sensors going to be employed for validation?
I'm not sure what the intent of the question is, because the sensor, if you had data from sensors that could be used for validation, I would say yes, but I don't think that's the question that was being asked.
I'm assuming it has to do with the new test facility question in regards to that.
Well, again, if you had a test facility and you had some better sensor that would give you data that would be more applicable for validation, maybe that makes sense. But certainly the emphasis on the proposal isn't on the test facility or in like sensor development or using advanced sensors in test data. Again, I would maybe put the emphasis on, you're not necessarily going to do enough tests to validate these codes. They're very complex codes that span a large, broad field of phenomena that could be modeled. And so you can't validate your way through this code by building test facilities and running huge numbers of tests. And that's exactly the problem that we're trying to overcome, is the recognition that we can't run enough tests to get enough validation to really validate the full spectrum of the codes. And so what is a good methodology for validating codes when it's not practical to build these multi-million-dollar test facilities to validate these codes? So that's really the question. The emphasis is not on building test facilities or running tests to get validation data, but it's on novel methods to validate the codes, recognizing you can't spend all this money on test facilities.
So to be clear, not all tools have to be included in the proposal?
Yes.
Correct.
Correct.
Can you clarify again what specifically traditional validation means? Is the program interested in calibration of Relapse 7 code?
If it was just a comparison of Relapse 7 to, say, experimental data, like what was done on other codes such as Relapse 5 and Trace and others, that would fit into the other call.
RC7.
The IRP call is the IRP call is intended to think outside the box, so to speak, and leverage different kinds of data. Again, not focusing mainly on one tool, but perhaps a spectrum of tools from a safety margin perspective